Hello, my name is Ant. Just recently we've celebrated Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and right now we're in the time of Tabernacles. So this is part of the three feasts during our autumn or the fall. So those three feasts are the Feast of Trumpets, which is Rosh Hashanah. There's Yom Kippur, which is a Day of Atonement, and Tabernacles, which is what we're in right at the moment. So what's the background of Tabernacles, and why do we celebrate it today? All right, well, basically, Tabernacles started back in Egypt when Israel was captives to the Pharaoh of Egypt, and at Passover they got delivered. They left Egypt, and then they went out into the wilderness. And in that time they were in the wilderness, they lived in tents. They were always living in tents. Now, this has a really good object lesson to it, because when they were living in the tents and they would move from camp to camp, God would always go with them. So at night you'd have the pillar of fire, and during the day you'd have the cloud. His presence was always with them. In that time they also built a tabernacle to him, which was like a mobile temple, like a tent temple. And in that it had three courts. It had the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies. And this was all a model of our body today. We have an outer court, that's our body, our flesh. We have the inner court, that's our soul, our minds, our thinking, our wills, our emotions. And then we have our Holy of Holies, which is the temple, which is the inner part of us, our spirit. And so this is what it set the whole, I suppose, picture of. It was talking about what we're like, what God's like, how he interacts with us. Because here in this life, the whole idea of a tent is that it's temporary. It's only a temporary structure. It moves around in this life and so forth. Our body is just a temporary structure. That's how it is. So in this temporary life we live in, these temporary structures, God is always with us. He goes with us through all our trials and our temptations and all the other things that we go through. And that's really the essence of what Tabernacles is all about. So Tabernacles will also be celebrated in the future. Jesus is going to come back. He talks about that in Zechariah chapter 14. It talks about the fact that tabernacles will be celebrated when he returns, and they again will make their tents, their booths. They will celebrate that from year to year. And it's a lesson there that life is temporary, but the king is always with them. Now that's some of the examples of what Tabernacles is about. Also, when they camped out in the wilderness, they would camp in the sign of a cross. That's in Numbers chapter 22. So there'd be 3 tribes to the north, 3 tribes to the south, 3 to the east and 3 to the west. And that formed a cross. So it was always, and at the center of that you had the tribe of the Levites. So there was always that inner tribe, that holy tribe that was set apart to God. Now the same thing there, it was always pointing to Jesus, even back then with all the tents. Now today, as we celebrate Tabernacles, we're looking forward to Jesus' return. That's what it's all about. We realise that the life we live here, it's only temporary. These bodies are only temporary. We're just passing through. It's not going to stay this way forever. So as we celebrate that, there are other things that come out in it. The tabernacle is also a type of a wedding. It can represent the huppah, where the bride and the groom actually consummate their marriage, and that's where they celebrate and live during the time of the wedding, which is usually a 1-week celebration. In those times and in those days, they would celebrate that for a week. They would party and they would live in this huppah, and they would consummate their marriage there. So it's like a consummation, it's like a coming together, it's like an intimacy, all of those things that are associated with marriage. It's like a joining together. The two become one. And that's precisely what Tabernacles is about. But there's much more to it than this. As much as it's about a marriage, Jesus himself tells a parable. And this is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. And it says, Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son." Now that certain king is God, and his son is Jesus. This is what Jesus is telling us about. "And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come." So that was Israel at the time. He called them, but they still went around their usual ways. Again, he sent out other servants saying, "Tell those who are invited, see, I prepared my dinner. My ox and fatted cattle are killed. All things are ready. Come to the wedding." But they made light of it, went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. Now that's talking about the prophets. They did indeed treat the prophets badly and murder many of them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious, and he sent out his armies to destroy those murderers and burnt up their city. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, as many as you find, invite them to the wedding." Now that is an invitation to you and me. We're all invited to this wedding when Jesus returns. So those servants went out to the highways, gathered together all who they found, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man there who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to them, "Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. Now, in the Oriental times that they lived, this is not part of our Western culture, but if a king or a nobleman had a feast, they would provide garments for their guests. There was a reason for that. The way you were dressed represented your status. So it would be an embarrassment to go to a nobleman's house or to a wedding dressed in a lower status. So they would provide those garments so that everybody would have equal status. It was a way of saving embarrassment, because in that culture, hospitality was everything. So a king would provide expensive garments so everybody was dressed the same, there was no embarrassment, and that was seen as good hospitality. So the king had to provide the garments. That's the thinking here. Now he says he finds a guest here without the garment. Now there's only one way to get that garment. That's through the king. Now interestingly, before Tabernacles, we celebrate Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. Now, the only way to get that garment is you have to first go through the atonement. That is repent, that is change, and that is go through the atonement, through the shedding of blood. And who's the one who shed his blood? It was Jesus. So Jesus is our Yom Kippur, he's our atonement. It's through that we get to go into the wedding and have the garment of righteousness, the garment of salvation. So that's what Yom Kippur is all about. So he said, "Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, take him away, and cast him out into outer darkness. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" Well, there you go. So that's the story, or the parable, of the king and the guest. So how do we come into that wedding? How do we get invited? Everybody gets an invite, but how do we get that robe of righteousness? First, we have to come to Jesus. First, we have to accept his salvation. And then we have the garment of righteousness. Have you invited Jesus into your life? Today's the day. Today is the day. Accept him. Don't refuse him. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Accept his atonement, what he did on the cross for you. So anyway, that's what we celebrate during the Feast of Tabernacles. Life is temporary. Give it to Jesus, because at the end, what it's all about is we're waiting for the King to come. Well, God bless you, and bye for now.